So let me take a little bit more time to discuss this one, because this is, I think, an important foundation for us to understand firm scope questions. This is part of a branch of economics often referred to as theory of the firm. It asks a very simple question of why do firms exist? Now, at first look, this might seem incredibly obvious, but as you begin to think about it more, it is a very nuanced question. At the heart of it, there's a question of why does not all economic activity get organized through the markets? There are in fact some very common economic activity that takes place more in a disaggregated fashion. Take movies, for example. Movies at the end of the day are large joint ventures where each of the different players, everything from the director to the actors and actresses to the gaffer, all the people involved are basically independent contractors who come together just for the purpose of making that one movie, and then they in essence disband after that and perhaps go to other projects and the like. Rather than a model where you might have one large firm who organizes and controls all of those assets, and those individuals would be simply employees of that larger firm. And there have been times in the history of Hollywood where we saw that type of model where the studios had individuals under contract. Another example of one where it's a disaggregated model would be the building of residential construction, a building of homes. Typically you have a general contractor, but then you have a whole host of subcontractors who come to work on that specific project. They're not employees of the general contractor, they have individual contracts they write to come together to execute on that project. And one could imagine, and we have seen examples of firms now who've moved into a very disaggregated model, kind of a virtual organization, where they source all their supply, they even outsource their manufacturing, perhaps their R&D, their distribution, and at the end of the day, perhaps they just keep a few core activities in what is called the firm. The heart of transaction cost economics is a recognition that all economic activity is in essence a series of transactions between independent actors. When we talk about the firm, what we're really talking about is ownership. Who owns the means of production? And what ownership ultimately gives you is the idea of residual rights of control. Is in essence the ability to choose what happens when disagreements and unforeseen contingencies arise. So going back to our builder example, if I am contracting with an electrician and that electrician has a tool, let's say, that breaks, well, it's that electrician's decision to replace it and how they'll replace it and what they'll use. Whereas if he was an employee of mine and that tool broke, well, now that becomes my responsibility and I get to determine. And maybe there's a question of whether he should spend a lot of money or a little money or what type of quality tool he should get at the end of the day. Another thing that residual rights of control allows us to do is help create common incentive mechanisms for coordinating. It allows us to structure relationships in a way that we're not constantly contracting on a daily basis that if I do this, will you pay me this much? Instead, we have employment contracts which are a little more open and allow for more productive work without having to renegotiate everything all the time. Ultimately, what ownership does is it minimizes various risks from transacting on the market. And this is where the idea of transaction costs come from. To have an economic exchange, it's more than just a transfer of money. There is often other things that need to be considered. The writing of contracts, and then the risks associated with those relationships are in and of themselves transaction costs as well. So I've mentioned before the holdup problem. Once again, this is if you commit yourself to one economic entity, you could find yourself in a position where things get renegotiated in a way that are unfavorable to you. For example, perhaps you are a contract manufacturer for another organization. If you build your facility so that you can only deliver for this one economic actor, this one firm, what happens if things change and they turn back to you and they know at this point you're beholden to them and they then negotiate better terms? That's the essence of holdup and opportunism. In some cases, it's just incredibly hard to separate efforts and resources expended. Teamwork is a great example of this. If we can't separate out what everyone's marginal contribution is, very hard to contract on that in a market situation. Information is notoriously difficult to write contracts for. Ken Arrow, Nobel Prize-winning economist, talks about a paradox in which to be able to value information, it needs to be revealed to you. But once the information is revealed to you, you have no need then to pay for that information because you've now been able to consume it. Various forms of private information create frictions in the marketplace as well. What we call adverse selection. The idea that I might know better what my quality is and what my abilities are than you do. And so when we contract, there's a hesitancy for me to perhaps share all the information about my capabilities, and that can lead to some perverse outcomes in the marketplace. And then finally, there's just simply uncertainties about future contingencies. We cannot know, once again, we don't have perfect foresight about all the things that might come up into the future that might change our relationships. Perhaps we're working as a contract manufacturer with Apple Computer, and then suddenly a new product comes along the line that we hadn't talked about before, and it structures and creates a new opportunity that we had not foreseen before. So these are all reasons why we limit the amount of market transactions and put things into this bucket we call the firm. The logical next question is, well, why isn't all economic activity then organized in one big firm? What are the things that push back on firm scope if transaction costs are leading us to try to bring everything within the boundaries of the firm? Well, the first answer is simply government. There are instances here where antitrust actions are taken to reduce monopoly power within an industry here, to try to restrict this creation of one big firm. And this was a concern going all the way back to Adam Smith, that he foresaw that if you weren't careful, businesses would grow to become monopolies. There are other things, though, beyond government that push back on one big firm. First one is bureaucratic costs. As organizations grow, coordination becomes more difficult, decision-making becomes slower and inflexible, and the firm becomes less able to adapt and quickly change to changing market conditions. And I'm sure we've all experienced that in some way or another in various organizations we've been affiliated there. So once again, while there might be some benefits in terms of minimizing transaction costs as an organization grows, these bureaucratic costs cause us to then start to constrain again how many things we would want to have under operation in one firm. Final one we want to think about are agency costs. As organizations grow, organizational politics become more pronounced. As people spend more time on influence games, trying to influence their manager or others within the organization. The opportunities for opportunistic behavior on part of managers become more pronounced. We can look at any number of examples in recent years where chief executive officers, even CEOs of companies, have acted in ways that were not in the best interest of the firm or its shareholders. One would imagine an entrepreneur, an owner-entrepreneur, would not have those issues. So once again, as things grow larger, we get more agency costs. This once again causes us to want to restrict the scope of firms. So ultimately what we get is a horse race between markets and firms when we think about how large a firm should be. One way to think about this is in the following graph. On the x-axis, the bottom axis, we have the complexity of the transaction. So you have simple transactions, let's say buying an apple at a marketplace. You can observe the apple, you can understand if the apple is of good quality or not. You know that if I hand over the dollar, I will get the apple. It's a simple transaction. Then we can think of much more complicated transactions around knowledge or information, or around complex technologies that increase the complexity of the transaction. So what you see here is a horse race between markets and firms where at first, when the complexity of the transaction is low, the costs of using the market, the risks and frictions, these transaction costs, are relatively low compared to the bureaucratic costs of trying to do these things in-house, if you will. But as the complexity increases, we eventually reach an inflection point where the risks and frictions caused by the market, these transaction costs, overtake the bureaucratic costs of using the firm, and we switch from wanting a market to a firm orientation. Now, what does this mean in practice? Well, this is very stylized. Obviously, this is not based on data. This is just a simple curve I've put on here. But it does communicate the kind of main empirical findings that researchers have found, which is the following. There's an optimal level of diversification, and that level will change depending on the industry and the situation. We know that there are benefits to diversifying, such that being diversified perhaps in a more related way, concentric way, gives benefits to the firm, increases performance over just being located in one dominant business. We also know, though, if you extend diversification too far to, for example, the conglomerate model, that will often undermine performance ultimately as a result. So there is some sweet spot. The question, of course, is how do we identify that sweet spot for any given firm? And it's going to vary if you take a Coca-Cola versus a General Electric. So this gets us back to our strategist challenge. We've talked about this many times in the past, this idea of looking at values, opportunities, and capabilities to identify a valuable competitive position. In essence, when we talk about firm scope and what businesses we should be in, it's the same exact question. We've just made our lives a little more complex now. Now we're thinking about multiple businesses represented here, each by these, bringing together these three circles here. So we have 4 different industries here. We're looking at valuable competitive positions uniquely in each of those, but then where the arrows come in is to suggest, well, what's the value created by holding these multiple positions at the same time? So the same analyses we would do in terms of determining our competitive position in a single market, our 5 forces, capabilities analysis, our competitive life cycle analysis, they all still are relevant here, but now we have to add this extra layer of analysis that says, well, by holding these multiple positions in multiple businesses, how does this create value overall for the enterprise? So let me summarize here, once again, some of the reasons for diversifying. Firms expand their scope to both leverage the rent-generating assets across markets, basically to improve their standing in individual product markets, and to garner these economic rents that we've been concerned about throughout this lecture series in individual markets. Once again, you diversify as a way to improve your standing in individual markets. They diversify for a number of reasons: market power reasons, these strategic reasons, eliminating duplicate costs, the synergy reasons, and these transaction costs, especially in vertical integration that we've been discussing. And then finally recognize that the firm is only one way of governing economic transactions. Think about the opportunity costs of other forms of economic exchange, joint ventures, simple contracting and the like, and weigh those off the decision to diversify the firm itself into that business. That's our end of our lecture for today. Thank you very much.